First note, thank you very much for inviting me here, the Commission here, to kind of take stock about what has just happened in Strasbourg. I'll be very brief. I'll just say a few words at the outset of this panel, allowing us to move swiftly on to the real experts here. And I would just like to say a few words, looking back a little bit at the motivations of why we came up with this proposal in the first place. Then to briefly kind of outline, give you a little bit of a flavor about the issues that proved to be difficult during the negotiations. But then also, given the fact that this panel is supposed to be a little bit forward-looking, to kind of look a little bit ahead at the challenges that are about to come more or less imminently, and perhaps a little bit later in time. So, first, why? A few years ago, when we started to look into this dossier, the first question that came to our mind was essentially, do we need to do anything at all? In a sense, the covered bond universe is very well functioning. You have a few big, very well functioning national markets which performed well also throughout the crisis. So in a sense, what problem is there to fix? True, in some member states, such as here, for the time being, there is as of yet no covered bond market, but that may perhaps not be a gigantic problem, or at least it seems perhaps also to be fixable. Do you really need EU action to fix that? Considering, for example, that not only do we have a very effective industry association in yourself, in a sense, that seems to be able to bring about a degree of industry harmonization unprodded by legislative means, and also there are other actors, as we heard this morning, EBRD, which I would like to salute, and the work that they are doing to kind of develop covered bond markets from the bottom in those countries that do not have them yet. So that was, I think, a legitimate question from us from a European perspective, the institutions. Do we need to do something to kind of build these markets further? Do we need EU action? And after reflection, consultation, further reflection, we came to the conclusion a few years ago that yes, there is a nuanced case to be made for EU action on covered bonds. I would just briefly set up that here, which was essentially to look at CMU potential and to put these markets on a sounder prudential basis. We thought, and we assessed this in our impact assessment, that if we managed to develop this funding instrument further, there would be significant additional benefits, both in terms of issuance and in terms of savings for credit institutions and for clients, which would merit actually laying a framework that would allow member states to kind of implement national covered bond laws in their respective markets. Also, we thought that given the importance these markets have already, and if they are going to develop on a further scale, we need to ensure further that they are prudentially sound, especially given all the kind of preferential treatments that they receive. So that's why we decided in the end that it makes sense to go ahead and to kind of lay a sound basis for further market developments by putting in place a common framework and to kind of tighten up a little bit in a measured and proportionate way the prudential treatment of these instruments. Now, what were then the main issues during negotiations? Well, essentially it can be summed up in the thing that I put up front, which is how far do you go? I mentioned at the outset, and you know full well, there are many well-established national markets, and in order to get political support for actually getting a framework in place, we had to ensure that we do not disrupt what is functioning well today, but add value where it is needed. And I think that during the negotiations, it became quickly clear where the tension points lay in that respect, and I think now in the panel we'll go into that in further detail. But essentially, it was the known and tried and tested areas of cover pool safety. How will you ensure that cover pools are safe? And particularly in that respect, which assets should be eligible to secure the cover pool? That was probably what kept us busy during the negotiations most of the times. Going back to the market development thing, we thought, as you have done here, labels are important. And there was a discussion about what type of labels, how many labels, which surprisingly, kept us busy for quite some time as well, up until the very end, actually. And then, of course, when you introduce new requirements, their governance and their calibration become very important too. So that also was quite important during negotiations. The liquidity buffer, which is something which is new in some member states. Extendable maturity structures. How should we handle them in order to balance the kind of interests of investors and issuers in terms of liquidity risk? And of course, probably what has kept us busy right until the very end, the scope of a preferential treatment and prudential requirements in the CRR. What I think managed to ensure that we could deliver as well, was to kind of remain true to the founding principles of this legislation, which is to stay at a principles-based minimum harmonization approach, which ensures that we can fit this regulation into the existing national markets without disrupting, while at the same time giving an off-the-shelf solution which is sufficiently clear for those to add value to those member states that do not yet have legislation in place. So that was, I think, one approach that carried through until the day. And also, to get agreement, the increase in prudence that I mentioned at the outset, to kind of try to tighten up the prudential regime, we needed to do that in a very proportionate and measured way in order to ensure political buy-in. Now, just briefly looking ahead. The covered bond deal is now basically a done deal. Of course, we have a council approval, which will come, and then official journal publication. But I think now the immediate next step will be member states' transposition. And I take note, just like the Vice President did yesterday, of this forum's willingness to help in that respect by setting up this task force that you mentioned yesterday. And I think that can be very helpful. Member states will probably need a lot of guidance, and they will probably ask for your views in that respect. And that will be an interesting exercise also from our respect as guardian of a treaty, that, of course, transposing a principles-based minimum harmonization directive leaves open a lot of different ways of transposing it. And we have to ensure that while keeping that legitimate measure of discretion, you still transpose it in a way that remains true to the principles that we have set out in the directive. After that, I think the next phase that will be the focus of you here in the room is adjusting to the new requirements. Even though we have aimed not to disrupt national markets, most of you will have to adjust a little bit, some more, some less. But there will be adjustment. And that is something that I think we will all have to monitor, you, to ensure that you comply and find efficient ways of complying with the new requirements, us, to see what the effects are on the ground, to feed into our further reflection once we start reviewing the directive and the regulation, which will come in a few years, and which I here have labeled long-term. But long-term sometimes gives you the impression that it's very far away. It is not. It's a few years down below, I would say, in about 5 years' time. Once the framework is in place, we will, of course, have to review its effectiveness, but we will in particular look at a few things that were discussed during these negotiations, but were lifted out of the negotiations in light of the very limited time that we had at our disposal in order to conclude this file during this current mandate. And chief of those, of course, the third country regime, equivalence is one thing, and of course the European secure notes, the ESNs. What do we do with them? And there we now have built-in reviews that will oblige us as the European Commission to, in a few years' time, come out with a report and possibly legislative proposals to complement the regime with action in this particular area. But of course, finally, the proof in the pudding will be to see whether this framework effectively, at the end of the day, will be conducive to further development of covered bonds. And that is what we will see going ahead. Thank you.